After 3 years of studying international business at Oxford, Marcus Chin stepped off the plane at San Francisco International Airport with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The familiar California sunshine felt warm on his face as he made his way through customs, his mind racing with thoughts of seeing his father again. Richard Chin, the tech billionaire whose empire had grown exponentially during Marcus's absence, had built their family fortune from a small software startup to a multinational corporation worth billions. Marcus had left for England as an uncertain young man, still struggling to find his place in the shadow of his father's overwhelming success. The constant pressure to live up to the Chin family name had been suffocating, and Oxford had offered him the chance to discover who he was beyond his father's expectations. Now, at 25, he felt more confident and mature, ready to bridge the gap that had grown between them during his extended absence. The Uber ride to the family estate in Palo Alto gave Marcus time to observe how much the tech industry had transformed the Bay Area. New glass towers reached toward the sky, and the traffic seemed even more congested than he remembered. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications from social media, friends welcoming him back, and business contacts his father had introduced him to years ago. The digital world had evolved rapidly, and he wondered if he'd kept pace with the changes. As the car pulled through the familiar gates of the Chin compound, Marcus felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him. The manicured gardens, the modern architecture of their home, and the view of the San Francisco Bay beyond all looked exactly as he remembered. But something felt different. Perhaps it was his own perspective that had changed. The house that had once seemed like a palace now felt more like a beautiful but lonely fortress. His father had texted earlier that morning, saying he was working from home and looking forward to their reunion. Marcus had imagined they would sit in Richard's study, sharing stories of the past 3 years over expensive scotch. He pictured his father asking about his studies, his plans for the future, and perhaps finally treating him as an equal rather than just an extension of the family business. The front door was unlocked, as it always had been within the secure compound. Marcus stepped into the marble foyer, his footsteps echoing in the familiar space. The house felt unusually quiet, no housekeeper bustling about, no assistant rushing to greet him, no sound of his father's voice on conference calls that had been the soundtrack of his childhood. "Dad," he called out, his voice carrying through the high-ceilinged rooms. The silence was broken by the sound of running water coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Marcus followed the sound, his confusion growing with each step. He had expected a warm welcome, perhaps a small celebration of his return, but instead found himself walking through empty rooms toward what sounded like domestic activity in an area of the house he rarely visited. As he approached the source of the sound, Marcus could hear his father's voice, though he couldn't make out the words. There was something different about his tone, softer, more gentle than the commanding presence Marcus remembered. The young man who had left home feeling like a disappointment to his billionaire father was about to discover something that would fundamentally change his understanding of the man who had raised him. Marcus followed the sound of running water and his father's voice toward the utility area of their sprawling home, a part of the house he'd rarely visited during his youth. The Chin family had always employed a full staff, housekeepers, gardeners, a chef, and various assistants who handled the mundane tasks of daily life. The idea of his billionaire father doing any kind of domestic work was so foreign to Marcus that he couldn't quite process what he was seeing as he rounded the corner. There, in the large laundry room with its commercial-grade washers and dryers, stood Richard Chin, sleeves rolled up, carefully hand-washing delicate fabrics in a basin filled with sudsy water. But it wasn't just any laundry. Marcus could clearly see that his father was gently scrubbing what appeared to be women's undergarments, handling each piece with meticulous care. The sight was so incongruous with everything Marcus knew about his father that he stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak or move. Richard hadn't noticed his son's arrival yet, completely absorbed in his task. He was speaking softly to someone Marcus couldn't see, his voice carrying a tenderness that the younger man had never heard before. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Richard was saying. "We'll get these cleaned up properly." The doctor said gentle soap and cool water would be best for removing the stains without damaging the fabric. His tone was patient and caring, nothing like the brusque executive manner Marcus remembered from his childhood. The shock of the scene rendered Marcus speechless. His mind raced through possible explanations, each more bewildering than the last. Had his father remarried in secret? Was he having an affair? The man who had built a tech empire through ruthless determination and unwavering focus was now doing laundry by hand, treating delicate undergarments with the care of a professional dry cleaner. It seemed impossible, yet there he was, witnessing it with his own eyes. Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions washing over him: confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been disappointment. He had returned from Oxford hoping to find a way to connect with his father as equals, to bridge the gap between the distant businessman and the son who had always felt like a secondary priority. Instead, he had stumbled upon what appeared to be evidence of a secret life that his father had hidden from him. The rational part of Marcus's mind told him to quietly back away, to give his father privacy and ask questions later in a more appropriate setting. But his feet seemed rooted to the floor, and his presence in the doorway was becoming increasingly awkward. He cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle his father, but needing to announce his arrival before the situation became even more uncomfortable. Richard looked up at the sound, his hands still submerged in the soapy water. For a moment, father and son stared at each other across the laundry room, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Richard's expression cycled through surprise, embarrassment, and something that might have been resignation. It was clear that this was not how either of them had envisioned their reunion after 3 years apart. "Marcus," Richard said finally, his voice carefully controlled, but lacking its usual authority. "You're home earlier than I expected." He made no move to stop what he was doing, as if he had been caught in an act that was both deeply personal and somehow shameful. The powerful businessman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals looked suddenly vulnerable, caught in a moment of unexpected intimacy that his son was never meant to witness. The silence stretched between father and son for what felt like an eternity before Richard slowly lifted his hands from the sudsy water dripping from his fingers back into the basin. Marcus watched, transfixed, as his father carefully dried his hands on a nearby towel, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the obvious awkwardness of the situation. The billionaire who had built an empire on decisive action now seemed uncertain, as if weighing his words carefully before speaking. "I suppose you have questions," Richard said finally, his voice lacking its usual commanding presence. He gestured toward the laundry he'd been so carefully tending, and Marcus could see now that the delicate items were indeed women's undergarments, silk and lace pieces that had clearly been expensive and were now being treated with extraordinary care. The sight continued to jar against everything Marcus thought he knew about his father. "Dad, Marcus began, then stopped, unsure how to frame the questions tumbling through his mind. Who did these belong to? Why was his father personally handling such an intimate task? And why did he look more vulnerable in this moment than Marcus had ever seen him, even during the most stressful periods of building his business empire? The young man who had spent 3 years at Oxford learning to navigate complex social situations found himself completely at a loss for words. Richard seemed to interpret his son's silence as judgment, and his shoulders sagged slightly. "I know how this must look," he said, turning back to the basin and resuming his careful washing. The great Richard Chun, captain of industry, reduced to doing laundry by hand. "I'm sure it's not the homecoming you were expecting." There was a bitter edge to his voice that Marcus had never heard before, as if his father was already defending himself against accusations that hadn't been made. But as Marcus watched his father's gentle movements, the careful attention to preserving the delicate fabrics, a different interpretation began to form in his mind. This wasn't the behavior of a man engaged in some sordid affair or embarrassing secret. The tenderness in Richard's voice when he'd been speaking to the unseen person, the meticulous care he was taking with each piece, it spoke of love and concern, not shame or guilt. "Dad," Marcus said more firmly, stepping into the laundry room. "What's going on? Who do these belong to?" He kept his voice calm and non-judgmental, though his heart was racing with curiosity and concern. The father he remembered had been emotionally distant, focused entirely on business success and material achievement. This man washing undergarments by hand seemed like a completely different person. Richard paused in his washing, his hands stilling in the water. When he looked up at Marcus, his eyes held a mixture of pain and something that might have been relief. "They belong to Elena," he said quietly. Your stepmother." The words seemed to catch in his throat, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to use it. "We married 2 years ago, but she's been very ill." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His father had remarried and never told him? For a moment, anger flashed through him. How could Richard have kept something so important secret? But the pain in his father's eyes, the gentle way he was caring for these intimate belongings, suggested a story far more complex than a simple case of family secrecy. Marcus realized that his unexpected homecoming had revealed not a scandal, but a love story he had never been told. "She's resting upstairs," Richard continued, his voice soft with concern. "The chemotherapy has been particularly difficult this week." The word chemotherapy hung in the air like a revelation, suddenly recontextualizing everything Marcus had witnessed. This wasn't about shame or secrecy. It was about a man caring for his sick wife in the most intimate and practical ways possible. Marcus felt his anger evaporate, replaced by a complex mix of guilt and admiration. "Cancer?" he asked quietly, and Richard nodded, his attention returning to the delicate fabrics in his hands. "Ovarian cancer, stage 3. We've been fighting it for 18 months now." The "we" in that sentence spoke volumes about how Richard saw their battle, not as something Elena faced alone, but as a shared struggle. "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus asked, though the question came out more hurt than angry. Richard paused in his washing, considering his response carefully. "She didn't want you to come home out of obligation or pity," he said finally. "She wanted to meet you when she could be herself, not just a sick woman. And I wasn't sure how to explain that I'd found love again at my age." The honesty in his father's voice was striking. This was perhaps the most vulnerable conversation they'd ever had, certainly more open than any exchange during Marcus's childhood. The billionaire businessman who had always seemed invincible was revealing fears and uncertainties that made him suddenly, powerfully human. "I'd like to meet her," Marcus said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Richard looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "Are you sure?" "She's not. She doesn't look like she did when we married. The treatment has been hard on her." There was protective love in his voice, the same tone Marcus remembered from his childhood when Richard would defend him against criticism from teachers or coaches. "I'm sure," Marcus replied firmly. "She's important to you, which makes her important to me." Richard's smile was small but genuine, the first real warmth Marcus had seen since his arrival. "Let me finish this first," Richard said, indicating the laundry. "She had an accident earlier, couldn't make it to the bathroom in time. It embarrasses her terribly, but it's just part of what we're dealing with now." The casual way Richard discussed such intimate details revealed how completely he had embraced the role of caregiver. Marcus watched his father's hands move gently through the water, treating his wife's most personal belongings with the same careful attention he once gave to multi-million-dollar business negotiations. It was perhaps the most loving act Marcus had ever witnessed, made more powerful by its complete lack of performative drama. "The staff doesn't know about these episodes," Richard continued. "Elena made me promise to keep her dignity intact as much as possible. So I handle the personal care myself." Marcus understood now why the house had been so quiet, why his father was personally managing such intimate tasks. This was about love and dignity, about protecting someone precious from unnecessary embarrassment. As Richard carefully wrung out the last piece of delicate fabric and hung it to dry, Marcus realized that his homecoming had revealed something extraordinary. The father he had always seen as emotionally distant had become someone capable of profound tenderness and sacrifice. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms was now commanding respect in an entirely different arena, as a devoted husband caring for his wife through the most challenging period of their lives. 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself following his father up the curved staircase to the master suite, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. The hallway was quieter than he remembered, with thick carpeting that muffled their footsteps and blackout curtains drawn across the windows to create a peaceful, healing environment. Richard moved with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned to navigate around illness and sleep schedules. Before they reached the bedroom door, Richard stopped and turned to his son. "She tires easily," he said quietly, "and the medication sometimes makes her confused or emotional. But she's still brilliant, still funny, when she feels well enough. I fell in love with her mind first, then her heart." There was pride in his voice, the same tone he'd once used when describing a particularly successful business acquisition, but infinitely warmer. Richard knocked softly on the door and opened it slightly. "Elena, sweetheart? Marcus is home. He'd like to meet you if you're feeling up to it." A weak voice responded from within, and Marcus caught the faint trace of an accent he couldn't quite identify. "Please, I would love to meet him. Give me just a moment." The voice carried warmth despite its obvious fatigue. While they waited, Richard straightened the already perfect hallway, clearly nervous about the introduction. "She was a literature professor at Stanford when we met," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was giving a guest lecture on technology and education, and she challenged everything I said. I'd never been so thoroughly and eloquently taken apart by someone half my size." His smile was fond at the memory. The door opened, and Marcus got his first glimpse of Elena Chen. She was a small, elegant woman in her early 50s, wearing a beautiful silk robe that couldn't quite hide how much weight she'd lost. Her head was covered by a colorful headscarf, but her eyes were bright with intelligence and curiosity. Despite her obvious illness, she carried herself with dignity and grace. "So you're the famous Marcus," Elena said, extending a thin hand toward him. Her smile was genuine and warm, transforming her gaunt features into something beautiful. "Your father talks about you constantly. I feel like I know you already." Her accent was subtle but present, Spanish, Marcus realized, which explained some of the exotic touches he'd noticed throughout the house since his return. Marcus took her hand gently, surprised by the firmness of her grip despite her frail appearance. "It's wonderful to meet you, Elena. I'm sorry I didn't know about you sooner." She waved dismissively at his apology. "Your father wanted to tell you, but I asked him to wait. I wanted our first meeting to be about getting to know each other, not about managing my illness." Elena settled into a comfortable chair by the window, Richard immediately moving to adjust pillows behind her back and ensure she had water within reach. The attention was so natural, so automatic, that Marcus realized this had become their routine. His father, who had once been waited on by an army of staff, had become someone's primary caregiver. "Tell me about Oxford," Elena said, her eyes lighting up with genuine interest. "I studied there briefly as a graduate student. Did you spend much time in the libraries? The Bodleian was like heaven to me." As Marcus began describing his favorite study spots and the books that had influenced him most, he watched Elena's face come alive with intellectual engagement. For the next hour, they talked about literature, philosophy, and the differences between American and European academic approaches. Elena was clearly brilliant, her mind sharp despite the medications and fatigue. She challenged Marcus's ideas respectfully but thoroughly, much as she must have challenged his father during that first meeting at Stanford. Marcus began to understand what had captured Richard's heart. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus witnessed the quiet choreography of care that had become his father's second nature. Richard anticipated Elena's needs before she voiced them, adjusting the window shade when she seemed sensitive to light, bringing her medication at precisely the right intervals, helping her to the bathroom when she grew weak without making her feel helpless or embarrassed. It was a masterclass in devoted partnership. Elena dozed briefly during their conversation, her head falling back against the chair as exhaustion overtook her. Richard immediately moved to her side, gently repositioning her for comfort and covering her with a soft blanket. The tenderness of the gesture was almost too intimate to witness, yet Marcus found himself moved by the depth of love it revealed. This was not the calculated affection of a strategic marriage, but something profound and genuine. When Elena woke, she seemed momentarily disoriented, her eyes searching the room before settling on Richard's face with obvious relief. "I'm sorry," she murmured, embarrassed by her momentary confusion. "The medication makes me foggy sometimes." Richard took her hand immediately. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said firmly. "You're fighting the hardest battle of your life. A little rest is nothing to be ashamed of." Marcus watched this exchange with growing admiration for both of them. Elena's determination to maintain her dignity in the face of devastating illness was inspiring, while Richard's unwavering support provided her with the strength to keep fighting. Together, they had created something beautiful even in the midst of terrible circumstances. "Your father saved my life in more ways than one," Elena told Marcus when she felt more alert. "Not just by ensuring I had the best medical care, but by giving me a reason to fight. I had given up on love, convinced that I was too set in my ways, too independent for partnership. Then this stubborn businessman showed up in my classroom and changed everything." Richard's cheeks actually colored slightly at her words, a bashfulness that Marcus had never seen in his powerful father. "She's being modest," Richard said. "She challenged me to think beyond profit margins and market share. She taught me that there were more important ways to measure success than quarterly earnings reports. She made me want to be a better man." The conversation was interrupted by Elena's need for medication, a complex regimen that Richard managed with the precision he once applied to business ventures. Marcus watched his father carefully measure doses, check times against a detailed chart, and explain each medication's purpose to Elena as he helped her take them. The intimacy of medical care had become part of their daily reality. "Some days are harder than others," Elena admitted to Marcus, once the medication routine was complete. "The nausea, the fatigue, the way my body has betrayed me, it's not what either of us expected when we fell in love. But your father has never made me feel like a burden. He makes me feel cherished even on my worst days." Marcus began to understand that his father's devotion went beyond simple spousal duty. Richard had found, later in life, the kind of transformative love that changes everything. The man who had built an empire through aggressive determination had discovered that his greatest achievement was not professional but personal, creating a safe harbor for the woman he loved during the most vulnerable period of her life. As the sun began to set outside Elena's bedroom window, casting golden light across the room, Marcus realized that his unexpected homecoming had revealed something extraordinary. His father, whom he had always seen as emotionally unavailable, had actually been capable of profound love all along. Perhaps the distance Marcus had felt during his childhood wasn't coldness, but protection, Richard keeping his deeper emotions guarded until he found someone worthy of complete vulnerability. That evening, after Elena had settled in for the night with her pain medication, Richard invited Marcus to join him in his study for the conversation they both knew was inevitable. The room was exactly as Marcus remembered, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather chairs facing a fireplace, and the massive desk where Richard had conducted business calls late into the night throughout Marcus's childhood. But now the space felt different, warmer somehow, perhaps because Marcus was seeing his father with new eyes. Richard poured 2 glasses of the expensive scotch Marcus remembered from special occasions, then settled into the chair across from his son. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, both processing the emotional revelations of the day. Finally, Richard spoke. "I owe you an explanation about why I kept Elena's secret from you," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "You don't owe me anything, Dad," Marcus replied, though he appreciated his father's willingness to address the elephant in the room. "I understand now why you wanted to protect her privacy, especially given her condition." Richard shook his head. "It wasn't just about privacy. I was afraid you'd think I was being disloyal to your mother's memory." The mention of Marcus's mother, Richard's first wife, who had died in a car accident when Marcus was 12, brought a wave of complex emotions. Richard had never remarried, never even dated seriously as far as Marcus knew, dedicating himself entirely to business and to raising his son alone. The idea that Richard might feel guilty about finding love again had never occurred to Marcus. "Mom would have wanted you to be happy," Marcus said firmly, meaning every word. "She wouldn't have wanted you to spend the rest of your life alone." Richard's eyes grew misty, and Marcus realized this was perhaps the first time anyone had given him permission to move on from his grief. I told myself that for years, but I never quite believed it. Your mother she was everything to me. I thought that kind of love only came once in a lifetime. Richard went on to explain how he and Elena had met 3 years earlier, shortly after Marcus had left for Oxford. Their courtship had been slow and careful, two independent people in their 50s learning to open their hearts again. She made me laugh, Richard said with a soft smile. I had forgotten how to laugh, Marcus. Business success had become everything to me, but Elena reminded me that life was meant to be lived, not just managed. The marriage had been small and private, with only a handful of close friends in attendance. Richard had wanted to tell Marcus immediately, but Elena had convinced him to wait until Marcus returned from university. She wanted their first meeting to be natural, not colored by duty or obligation. Then, 6 months into their marriage, came the cancer diagnosis that had changed everything. She insisted we could beat it together, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Even when the doctors gave us statistics that weren't encouraging, Elena never lost her optimism. She said that whether we had 6 months or 60 years, we were going to make them count. That's when I realized I loved her even more than I had thought possible. Marcus listened to his father's story with growing understanding and admiration. The man he had always seen as emotionally reserved had actually been protecting something precious. First his grief for Marcus's mother, then his new love for Elena. The secrecy hadn't been about shame or deception, but about safeguarding the most important relationships of his life. I wish you had trusted me enough to tell me, Marcus said finally. I would have understood. And I would have wanted to help. Richard's smile was sad but genuine. I know that now. But at the time, I was trying to protect everyone, you from feeling obligated to cut short your studies, Elena from feeling like an intruder in our family, myself from the vulnerability of admitting how much I needed both of you. As the evening progressed, Richard shared more details about Elena's battle with cancer, the treatments they had tried, and the careful balance between hope and realism that governed their daily lives. Marcus began to understand that his father's devotion wasn't just about love, but about making the most of whatever time they had left together. The next morning, Marcus woke early and found his father already in the kitchen, preparing a complex breakfast designed to tempt Elena's fragile appetite. The sight of the billionaire businessman carefully arranging fresh fruit and preparing herbal tea with the attention of a professional chef was still jarring, but Marcus was beginning to appreciate the love that motivated such care. Good morning, Richard said, looking up from his preparations. Elena usually feels strongest in the mornings, so I try to get some nutrition into her before the fatigue sets in. He had dark circles under his eyes, and Marcus realized his father was probably surviving on very little sleep, monitoring Elena's condition throughout the night. Can I help? Marcus asked, moving to stand beside his father at the counter. Richard looked surprised by the offer, then smiled gratefully. She loves fresh orange juice, but it has to be just right. Not too pulpy, not too acidic. Would you mind? It was a small task, but Marcus felt honored to be included in Elena's care routine. As they worked together in comfortable silence, Marcus reflected on how much his relationship with his father had changed in just 24 hours. The distant, intimidating businessman of his childhood had been replaced by a man capable of profound tenderness and vulnerability. It wasn't that Richard had changed fundamentally, Marcus realized, but that circumstances had revealed aspects of his personality that had always been there, hidden beneath professional armor. When they carried the breakfast tray upstairs, Elena was awake and sitting up in bed, her laptop open as she worked on what appeared to be academic writing. Good morning, my loves, she said warmly, including Marcus in the greeting as naturally as if he had been part of the family for years. The casual endearment touched him more than he expected. Still working on your book? Richard asked, setting the tray across her lap and adjusting pillows behind her back. Elena nodded, her eyes bright with enthusiasm despite her obvious fatigue. I'm determined to finish it, she said to Marcus. A comparative analysis of Latin American literature and social justice movements. Your father has been my research assistant, learning to navigate academic databases with the same intensity he once brought to market analysis. Marcus spent the morning with Elena, learning about her academic work and her perspective on literature as a tool for social change. She was working to complete her book before her illness progressed further, driven by the desire to contribute something meaningful to her field. Her intellectual passion was infectious, and Marcus found himself engaged in discussions that challenged his own assumptions about literature and society. During a quiet moment when Elena dozed, Richard pulled Marcus aside. "She's determined to finish that book," he said softly. "It's given her a sense of purpose through the treatment, something beyond just surviving. I've hired research assistants, editors, whatever she needs. If she can't see it published, I'll make sure it happens posthumously." The matter-of-fact way he discussed the possibility of Elena's death revealed how completely he had accepted their reality. As the day progressed, Marcus watched his father's careful attention to Elena's needs, timing her medications, encouraging her to eat small amounts frequently, helping her move around to prevent blood clots, and providing the emotional support that kept her fighting. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally, yet Richard approached it with the same dedication he had once brought to building his business empire. "Your father is remarkable," Elena told Marcus during one of their private conversations. "I know this isn't the life he expected when we married, but he's never made me feel like I've cheated him out of the golden years we planned. He makes every difficult day bearable with his presence and love." Marcus began to understand that witnessing his father's devotion to Elena wasn't just about observing a touching marriage, but about learning what true partnership looked like. Richard had found something worth sacrificing for, worth reorganizing his entire life around. The man who had built an empire was now focused on building something far more precious, a sanctuary of love and dignity for the woman who had transformed his understanding of what mattered most. A week into Marcus's homecoming, Elena had what Richard quietly described as a bad day. The chemotherapy had left her nauseated and weak, unable to keep food down, and struggling with pain that the medication couldn't quite touch. Marcus watched his father move through the crisis with practiced calm, adjusting medications, calling doctors, and providing comfort without ever showing the fear that must have been consuming him. "Some days we fight the cancer," Richard explained to Marcus as they sat in the hallway outside Elena's room, giving her space to rest. "Other days we just try to make it through with as much dignity as possible. Today is one of those days." His voice was steady, but Marcus could see the toll that months of such uncertainty had taken on his father. It was during this difficult period that Marcus truly began to understand the depth of Richard's transformation. The man who had once controlled million-dollar deals with ruthless efficiency was now learning to navigate something that couldn't be managed or optimized, the unpredictable progression of illness and the gradual process of letting go. Yet he approached Elena's care with the same thoroughness he had once applied to business challenges. Marcus found himself stepping into a supporting role without being asked, learning Elena's routines and preferences so he could assist when Richard needed rest. He discovered that his stepmother preferred classical music when she was nauseous, that she found comfort in. Having someone read to her when she was too weak to focus on her own work, and that she had a particular way of arranging her pillows that helped with her breathing. One evening, as Marcus sat reading to Elena from her favorite collection of poetry, she reached over and took his hand. "Your father was so worried about how you would react to our marriage," she said softly. "He was afraid you'd see me as an intruder or think he was betraying your mother's memory. But I can see now that you have his capacity for love. You've accepted me not out of duty, but because you understand what we mean to each other." The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful of Marcus's life. Elena shared stories about his father that revealed sides of Richard's personality that Marcus had never seen, his vulnerability when facing her diagnosis, his determination to learn everything possible about her condition, and his willingness to set aside his pride to ask for help when he needed it. "He loves with his whole heart," she said. "I think he always did, but he had to learn to trust it again." Elena also spoke honestly about her prognosis and her hopes for Richard's future after she was gone. "I want him to remember how to be happy," she said, her voice growing tired but determined. "He spent so many years taking care of everyone else, first you, now me. When I'm gone, I want him to take care of himself, to find joy in simple things, to remember that he's worthy of love. The rawness of the conversation was almost overwhelming, but Marcus recognized it as a gift. Elena was sharing her deepest fears and hopes, treating him not as Richard's son but as someone who cared about the same person she loved. It was a level of trust and intimacy that spoke to how completely she had embraced him as family. That night, after Elena had fallen asleep, Marcus found his father in the study, staring out the window at the lights of Silicon Valley spread below them. "She's an extraordinary woman," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside Richard. "I understand now why you love her so much." Richard smiled, his eyes still fixed on the view outside. "She changed everything for me, Marcus. She taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that caring for someone else can be the most powerful thing you ever do." As father and son sat together in comfortable silence, Marcus realized that his unexpected homecoming had given him something invaluable, not just a new understanding of his father, but a model for what love could look like when it was tested by the most difficult circumstances. Richard and Elena's marriage, forged in the shadow of terminal illness, had become a masterclass in devotion, dignity, and the courage required to love completely even when loss is inevitable. 3 months after Marcus's return, Elena's condition had stabilized somewhat, allowing for better days mixed with the difficult ones. The family had settled into a new rhythm that included Marcus as an integral part of Elena's care team and Richard's support system. The house that had once felt like a fortress of business success had been transformed into something warmer and more human, a place where love was measured not in profit margins, but in small acts of daily devotion. Marcus had made the decision to defer his graduate studies and remain in California, taking on responsibilities with his father's company while also helping with Elena's care. The choice had surprised him. 6 months earlier, he would never have imagined choosing family obligations over his own ambitions. But witnessing his father's complete dedication to Elena had taught him that some things were more important than career advancement. The business world had taken notice of Richard's changed priorities. Board meetings were scheduled around Elena's treatment appointments, and Richard had delegated significant responsibilities to trusted executives so he could be present for his wife's care. Some industry observers criticized his reduced involvement, but Richard seemed genuinely unconcerned with external opinions about his choices. "I spent 20 years building a company," Richard told Marcus one afternoon as they worked together in Elena's garden, a project she had started during a period of feeling stronger. "But I've spent the last 18 months building something more important, a marriage based on complete trust and commitment. The company will survive without my constant attention. Elena's remaining time with me is irreplaceable." Marcus had watched his father discover that success could be redefined at any stage of life. The metrics that had once seemed crucial, market share, revenue growth, industry recognition, had been replaced by simpler but more profound measures of achievement. Could he make Elena smile on a difficult day? Could he anticipate her needs before she had to ask? Could he create an environment where she felt loved and dignified despite her illness? Elena's book was nearing completion, thanks largely to Richard's support and Marcus's assistance with research and editing. The project had given her a sense of purpose beyond her illness, and watching her work on it had taught both men about the importance of leaving a meaningful legacy. Her academic writing was brilliant and passionate, focused on how literature could inspire social change and give voice to marginalized communities. "She's going to outlive all the doctor's predictions," Richard said one evening, though Marcus could hear the uncertainty beneath his confident words. "She's too stubborn and too brilliant to let cancer win without a fight." Marcus had learned not to challenge his father's optimism, understanding that hope was sometimes the only weapon available against an implacable enemy. The relationship between Marcus and Richard had evolved from the formal distance of his childhood into something deeper and more authentic. They worked together as partners now, both in business and in caring for Elena, sharing responsibilities and decisions as equals rather than as father and subordinate son. The crisis of Elena's illness had stripped away the artificial barriers that had kept them emotionally distant for so many years. One evening, as they sat with Elena in her room while she worked on final revisions to her manuscript, Marcus realized that his father had achieved something remarkable. Richard had found a way to love completely without reservation, to prioritize relationship over reputation, and to find meaning in service rather than dominance. The billionaire businessman had become something rarer and more valuable, a man who understood that true success was measured in love given and received. "When I'm gone," Elena said suddenly, looking up from her laptop, "I want you two to take care of each other. Richard, don't retreat back into work the way you did after Marcus's mother died. And Marcus, don't let your father convince himself that he's too old for happiness. You both have so much love to give." Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen clearly into the hearts of the people she loved most. As the sun set outside Elena's window, casting golden light across the three of them, Marcus understood that his shocking homecoming discovery had led to the most important education of his life. He had learned that love could transform even the most successful and self-sufficient person into someone willing to wash underwear by hand, that vulnerability could be a form of strength, and that family could be created and recreated at any stage of life. The image that had so startled him months earlier, his billionaire father carefully washing delicate undergarments, now represented something beautiful and profound. It was a symbol of love without conditions, of care without embarrassment, and of the way that true partnership meant sharing not just the glamorous moments, but the most humble and necessary acts of daily life. Richard Chen had built an empire worth billions, but his greatest achievement was the sanctuary of love he had created for Elena during her time of greatest need. In learning to care for his wife with complete devotion, he had taught his son what it meant to love without reservation, to find purpose in service, and to measure success by the depth of one's commitment to the people who matter most. As Marcus prepared for bed that night, he reflected on how completely his understanding of his father had been transformed. The man he had once seen as emotionally distant had revealed himself to be capable of profound tenderness. The businessman he had admired for his ruthless efficiency had shown him something even more impressive: the willingness to prioritize love over profit, relationship over reputation, and human connection over professional achievement. The unexpected homecoming had given Marcus not just a stepmother to love and a father to understand differently, but a blueprint for how to live a meaningful life. He had learned that true strength lay not in building walls but in tearing them down, not in maintaining distance but in embracing vulnerability, and not in achieving success alone but in creating it together with the people you love. In the quiet of the house where a billionaire had learned to find his greatest joy in the simple act of caring for his wife, Marcus fell asleep knowing that he had witnessed something extraordinary: the transformation of a powerful man into a loving one, and the discovery that the most important victories in life were often the most private and personal ones.